Good afternoon. My name is Andrew Langlois, and today I am going to discuss an ethical dilemma involving organizational funding, client access to services, and our responsibilities as social workers when those interests come into conflict. I will look at the populations affected, the NASW Code of Ethics, and use Reamer's ethical decision-making framework to work through the dilemma and explain how we should move forward as an organization. The biggest ethical issue in this situation is balancing what our organization needs to survive with our responsibility to the people we are supposed to serve. The reality is that organizations need money to operate. Without funding, programs get cut, employees lose jobs, and clients lose services. At the same time, we cannot accept money without looking closely at the conditions attached to it and who might be harmed by those conditions. In this case, the grant would provide much needed funding and allow us to expand services. The problem is that funding requires us to prioritize families with children who have at least one employed adult. That immediately puts other clients at a disadvantage, including unemployed families, single adults, and people experiencing chronic homelessness. That is where the ethical conflict begins. On one side, we have a responsibility to keep the organization financially stable so we can continue providing services. There are employees, existing programs, and clients depending on that stability, and rejecting a major source of funding could mean serving fewer people overall. On the other side, we have our professional responsibilities as social workers and values such as service, social justice, dignity, and worth of the person and integrity. Simply accepting the grant without questioning the restrictions is not the right answer. But immediately rejecting the grant is necessarily not the right answer either. Losing that funded could hurt many of the same people we are trying to protect. That is what makes this a real ethical dilemma. There are consequences either way, and we have to consider all of them. The people who concern me the most are those who would be left out. A single adult who has been chronically homeless would not meet the criteria. A family where neither parent is currently working might not qualify either, even though that family could desperately need housing and case management services. Someone without children could have spent years experiencing homelessness and still be placed behind someone else simply because of the way the grant requirements were written. We also cannot assume that someone is unemployed simply because they do not want to work. There can be a lot more going on. A person could be dealing with a disability, mental health problem, substance use, discrimination, lack of transportation, lack of childcare, or any other number of barriers. Homelessness itself can make finding and keeping a job harder. It's difficult to worry about getting to work every morning when you do not know where you are going to sleep the night before. A 2021 study led by Megan Armstrong looked at the experiences of people experiencing homelessness and the barriers they face when trying to access health and social services. Armstrong and her colleagues found that many of these individuals have complex needs while also dealing with stigma and significant barriers to getting the help they need. The study also showed the importance of having services that understand this population rather than expecting everyone to fit into the same system. Our grant requirement has the potential to create one more barrier for people who already have several working against them. At the same time, we cannot lose sight of the fact that the families who do qualify are also vulnerable and need help. This should not become an argument over which group deserves services more. Both populations need assistance. The real question is whether we should allow a funding requirement to determine that one vulnerable population is more deserving of our services than another without considering individual circumstances and actual need. The NASW Code of Ethics gives us a foundation for addressing that question. Standard 1.01 addresses our commitment to clients and our responsibility to promote their well-being. That applies directly because the discussion we make will affect whether some clients can receive services. Standard 3.09 addresses our responsibilities to our employers, and that matters here as well. We do have responsibilities to the organization. We cannot ignore the financial needs of the agency because those financial needs directly affect our ability to serve clients. At the same time, our responsibility to our employer does not mean that we stop questioning policies when we believe those policies could harm the people we serve. Standards 6.01 and 6.04 deal with social welfare and social and political action and our responsibility to advocate for access to resources, services, employment, and opportunities. Those responsibilities become especially important when we are dealing with people experiencing poverty and homelessness. The ethical principles of social justice and dignity and worth of the person also apply. If we start determining who receives help, mainly based on whether they have a job or whether they have children, we need to seriously question whether that fits with those values. The code does not make the decision for us, but it gives us a professional foundation for how we should approach it. To work through this dilemma, I recommend using social work ethics scholars Frederick Reamer's ethical decision-making framework. The advantage of using Reamer's framework is that it gives us a structured process instead of allowing the decision to be driven by emotion, pressure from management, or simply the amount of money involved. The first step is identifying the ethical issues and the values and responsibilities that are in conflict. In our case, we have responsibilities to vulnerable clients, but we also have responsibilities to the organization and to all other clients who depend on it. We also have to consider social justice and whether the grant requirements create an unfair barrier to services. The second step is identifying everyone who could be affected by the decision. That includes the families who qualify for the grant, unemployed families and single adults who may be excluded, current clients, future clients, employees, agency leadership, and the foundation providing the money. We also need to look beyond our own organization. If we turn people away, those clients do not simply disappear. They may show up at another nonprofit, a shelter, an emergency room, or another community service that is already stretched thin. Our decision can have consequences throughout the community. The third step is identifying our possible course of action and considering the consequences of each one. We could accept the grant exactly as it is, that provides the funding but creates the ethical problem of excluding clients. We could reject the grant completely, that avoids participation in the restriction, but could result in cuts to existing services. We could accept the grant while finding separate funding for clients who do not qualify. We could also go back to the foundation and try to negotiate the restriction. There may also be room for compromise. The foundation might agree that this funding will primarily serve the population it wants to target, while allowing us to continue serving other clients through other resources. Before we treat this as an all or nothing decision, we need to determine whether options like that are available. The next part of the framework requires us to weigh those choices against our professional ethics, organizational policies, available evidence, and the possible harm each decision could cause. A 2023 study led by Melissa Iverson examined how requirements placed on human service organization by funders can affect service delivery and social justice. Iverson and her colleagues found that funder requirements can influence how services are delivered and even which clients receive attention. That should concern us because we do not want the source of our funding to gradually determine which clients our organization considers worth helping. That can happen slowly, We make one change because we need a particular grant, then another funding opportunity comes along with a different requirement, so we make another change. Eventually, we could find ourselves designing programs around what funders are willing to pay for instead of what people in our community actually need. Consultation is another important part of the framework, and a decision this significant should not be made by one administrator or by upper management alone. We should involve agency leadership, social workers, frontline employees, and an ethics committee or legal counsel if those resources are available. Frontline staff need to be included because they may see consequences that administrators do not. They are the ones sitting across from clients and seeing what happens when someone cannot get the services they need. Their experience can tell us a lot about how this policy will actually work once it moves from a written grant requirement into everyday practice. We also need to hear from the people who will actually be affected by the decision. In their 2020 book on program management and leadership in social work, Rothfuss and Piepenbring emphasize the importance of including stakeholders in major organizational decisions, especially consumers and people who may otherwise be underrepresented. That matters here because it would be very easy for us to sit around a conference table and decide what is best without hearing from the people who could actually lose access to services because of our decision. The final part of REMA's framework involved making and documenting the decision and then monitoring what happens afterward. The monitoring piece is especially important. We can make what appears to be the best decision based on the information available today and find out 6 months later that it is hurting people in ways we did not anticipate. For that reason, we should document not only the final decision, but also why we made it, what alternatives we considered, who we consulted, and what consequences we expect. Then we can compare those expectations with what actually happens. Our ethical responsibility does not end once the policy is implemented. As social workers, our responsibility in this situation is also more than simply following the direction of upper management. We have an obligation to raise ethical concerns, advocate for our clients, explain the possible consequences, and offer alternatives. At the same time, we need to recognize the financial reality facing the organization. If we take a position that results in the organization losing enough funding, that programs close or employees are laid off, we may end up hurting the people we are trying to protect. Part of leadership is being willing to raise concerns that management may not want to hear, but we also need to come to the table with solutions. Simply saying that the grant is unfair and should be rejected does not solve the problem. We should be prepared to explain the ethical concerns, identify who will be affected, provide evidence, and recommend realistic alternatives. Our first course of action should be to go back to the foundation and try to renegotiate the requirement. We should show them who will be excluded and explain why employment and family status do not necessarily tell us who needs help the most. We should also explain how the restriction could conflict with the organization's mission and the professional values guiding the services we provide. We should ask whether the foundation would consider broadening the criteria. Another possibility would be allowing us to use most of the grant for their preferred population while still serving us some flexibility to serve people outside that group. There is a major difference between asking us to prioritize a particular population and requiring us to completely shut the door on everyone else. If the foundation refuses to change the restriction, our next step should be finding ways to accept the grant without abandoning the clients who do not qualify. That could include unrestricted donations, government funding, another grant, or partnerships with other organizations in the community. Leadership should also look at whether existing unrestricted funding could be shifted to maintain at least some services for the excluded population. If we ultimately have to operate under the restriction, minimizing harm becomes extremely important. We should establish strong referral agreements with other housing programs with mental health, substance use, employment, healthcare, and social service providers. Those relationships should be in place before we start turning people away. Our idea of a referral also cannot simply be handing someone a phone number and sending them on their way. If someone is chronically homeless and already struggling to navigate several different systems, giving them another phone number probably is not going to accomplish much. Whenever possible, we should use a warm handoff where a case manager helps connect the client with the other organization, confirms that the service is actually available, and follows up afterward. Armstrong and colleagues found that people experiencing homelessness benefit from professionals who understand the population. Better coordination between services and approaches that remove barriers to care. That means we should be building relationships with other agencies before we need them rather than waiting until someone is standing in front of us and we have nowhere to send them. We should also track what happens to the people we cannot serve. How many people are we turning away? Why are they being excluded? Were we able to connect them with another provider? If not, what happened to them? Are certain groups being affected more than others? That information gives us something concrete to take back to leadership and the foundation. Instead of simply saying we believe the restriction is harmful, we can show them what is actually happening. If the evidence shows that the policy is causing significant harm, then we have an ethical responsibility to address it rather than saying those are simply the rules. The broader concern is what decisions like this can eventually do to an organization. A nonprofit can start with a clear mission and gradually begin changing what it does based on where the money is coming from. Sometimes each individual change may seem small and necessary, but if that continues, eventually the funding starts driving the mission instead of the mission driving the funding. That is where the mission drift becomes a serious concern. There is also the issue of organizational trust. Our clients need to believe that when they come for us for help, they will be treated with dignity and that we'll consider their individual circumstances. Imagine being chronically homeless, finally asking an organization for help, and being told that you would have qualified if you had a child or a job. Even if we explain that the requirement came from the funder, that person is probably going to see our organization as another part of the system that rejected them. Our employees also need to trust that leadership is making decisions based on the organization's mission and professional ethics and not simply chasing the next grant. If frontline social workers repeatedly have to turn away people they believe desperately need help because those clients do not fit funding requirements, that can affect morale, trust in leadership, and ultimately the quality of services we provide. There can also be serious long-term consequences for clients. Someone who cannot get housing assistance today may continue experiencing homelessness, which can make employment, healthcare, mental health treatment, substance use recovery, and basic stability even harder. That means a decision made at the organizational level can have consequences far beyond whether someone receives one particular service. In the end, I do not recommend that we automatically reject the grant, but I also do not recommend that we simply accept the conditions because the organization needs the money. Using Reamer's framework gives us a way to examine the entire situation, involve the people affected by the decision, consult with our colleagues in leadership, and advocate with the foundation to change or loosen the restriction. Our first goal should be finding a way to keep the funding while removing or reducing the harm created by the eligibility requirement. If the foundation will not change the restriction, then we need to find other ways to protect services for the people who would otherwise be excluded. We also need to monitor the results and be willing to change course if the evidence shows that our decision is causing more harm than we expected. There probably is not a solution where everybody wins. If there were, this would not really be an ethical dilemma. Our responsibility is to make the best decision we can while considering both the immediate and long-term consequences for our clients and the organization. We need funding to do this work, and there is nothing wrong with recognizing that reality. But there has to be a point where we ask whether the conditions attached to the money are changing who we are and why our organization exists. Funding should support our mission. We should not change our mission or decide that certain vulnerable people are no longer worth serving simply because that makes us easier to fund. Thank you for your time.